Well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your lunch to come hopefully learn about how you can scale Ask Data. And if that's the topic you're interested in, you're in the right place. And if you weren't here for that topic, I think you should stay anyways because it's going to be awesome. And we're going to have a great time and learn, hopefully, a lot of really helpful information. So we have heard a lot of really positive commentary from our customers. Ask Data is awesome. It's clear. It's helpful. And we want everyone in this room to be able to say the same thing. But we have so many questions on how we can go from learning about what it is to successfully deploying it. And hopefully, after the session, you'll have all the tools and tips you need to say the same thing. And so let's walk through the agenda of what we're going to cover today. We'll give a quick primer on what Ask Data is and do a deep dive into the keynote demo. We'll take a look at all the examples that you saw in the opening and talk about what's happening behind the scenes. And then we'll focus the majority of our time talking about best practices, use cases, and all the steps and tips you need to go back to your organization and companies and actually get going using Ask Data. And at the end, we'll have about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. So please save those questions, and we'll make sure to have time at the end to address them. Are we still good on audio back there, guys? Great. OK. We're all data people, so what better way to tell you about myself than with data? So I've been in product and in the Valley for almost 8 years now, been a part of all the 4 releases of Ask Data that we've shipped. I have 3 animals, been at 2 Tableau conferences, and I've been at Tableau for about 1.5 years, and I have 1 fiance that you see there.
All right, and a little bit about me. I got married last week, so I have 1 wife. And I'm the former co-founder and CTO of a startup called ClearGraph, which Tableau acquired in 2017. And at ClearGraph, we built some of the foundational technology behind Ask Data. And now I'm a development manager on the Ask Data team.
Great, thanks, Ryan. OK, so what is Ask Data? Simply put, it's a natural language interface to interact with your data in Tableau. And it simply allows you to ask a question and get visual, relevant results back. And as I mentioned, it starts with a question. In this example, you can see that we've typed a question in, total sales for each region. There's a lot of magic happening behind the scenes that we'll touch on throughout the presentation. But ultimately, you get back a Tableau visualization. And given that Ask Data is completely integrated into the platform, you can expect all the familiar properties of the visualization in terms of interactivity and flexibility that you would expect in Tableau today. So let's take a second to actually walk through the example that you saw in the keynote to give a better perspective of what Ask Data is. So I'm going to switch back over to Ask Data. So this is that same Cash for Clunkers program that you saw Samantha mention. So the first question that was asked was how many cars were purchased as part of that program. And you can see that every question that I type has a corresponding interpretation. And that interpretation is really helpful because if we want people making decisions from that data, they have to trust the results. And what better way to do that than to clearly understand how the system interpreted your question? So here, we can see that how many cars is resolved by Ask Data to the sum of number of sales. And we'll give that a second. Let's go full screen there. And we can see that there's about 670,000 cars that were purchased as part of this program. But you don't have to stop there. One of the important principles in Ask Data is conversation. And oftentimes, the first question is just a starting point, and you have follow-up questions. So you can ask those follow-up questions while maintaining context of that first result. So if we want to break this down by make, I can simply type in by make. But again, you don't have to specify that exactly how Ask Data expects it. I may have another way of expressing that question, like for each make. And again, a natural language system has to be robust to that variance in terms of how people reason about these analytical concepts. So let's go ahead and select that, and we can see now that we carried the context of the sum of number of sales and have broken that down by make. You also notice that we didn't specify which visualization type to select because there's a lot of visualization best practices already built into Ask Data. We picked the bar chart, we automatically sorted it, and so much more. But let's continue filtering our data down and asking more questions. So I'll ask for just the sales in California. And notice in the interpretation that California is actually a state, obviously, but I didn't specify state, and I don't have to. And that's because our data index allows you to ask about those values without specifying the corresponding field. And it's oftentimes, when we have hundreds of fields, we don't understand the hierarchy or the relationships of those values that I know about, and that's okay. You can ask about those questions and those values, and we'll traverse the data and give you back all the corresponding fields that have that value. So I'll select California, and now in a few quick questions, we've asked about the total sales, broken down by make, just for California. Changing any part of this question is super easy. I can click on any of these phrases and make refinements. So if I want to change California to another state, I can simply click on California and see all of the other values in that field. I can select Alabama or any other value that I care about. But I also have the ability to search in more advanced ways like wildcard operations. I can use contains or start functions by simply clicking on them. Or I can change this to an exclusion instead of an inclusion. But I'm just going to keep the new state of Alabama and add that in, and now I'm good to go. Cool. So you saw how easy it was to make that refinement. But I can also do that conversationally, and I don't have to just be using that point-and-click interface. So let's change it to Nevada instead. And you can see that in that follow-up question, we can infer that we're looking to replace the state of Alabama with Nevada. So let's go ahead and select that. And you saw how easy it was. Great. If I want to ask a new question, I can simply click on this new sheet option in the bottom here, just like you would in Tableau today, and ask a brand new question. And the next one was looking at the top 5 states by price. And you'll see that the question seems like a very natural way to ask about the top 5 states, but you'll notice that I didn't specify an aggregation for price. It was a very underspecified and ambiguous question. And there's usage and learning mechanisms in Ask Data that will help resolve the missing pieces so we can bring in average price based on how people use that field in their questions in Ask Data to make this a complete question. So now we can see the top 5 states and all the states that fall out of the set. And that's a really helpful analytical and visual practice, because if I choose the top 5 arbitrarily, I don't really know what I'm excluding. And if there's something right at the threshold that changes my perspective on what I want, I might be better informed by seeing the entire in list and out list. And if I want to make and expand that limit, I can again simply click on top 5 and make that the top 15, the top 30, whatever I want. Super easy. Okay, the next example was about time series calculations. It's one of the most common ways that we look at growth and usage over time. So in Ask Data, you can actually create calculations on the fly without having them in the data model from the start. So let's look at the daily growth of sales. And I misspelled growth, okay. And you can see that from that question, we can infer that we're looking for the day over difference in the sum of number of sales over the sale date. And again, I didn't really specify a time interval here, and Ask Data will leverage usage information again to pick the most common, most popular date time entity to make my analysis relevant and complete. So with the simple question, we just created a really complex and powerful table calculation right on the fly. But calculations don't stop there. You can also do ratios, multiples, sum and differences of measures in Ask Data on the fly. So let's take a look at computing the difference between the miles per gallon of new cars versus the trade-in MPG by, can't spell today, by state. And again, you can see that I'm creating these calculations right now dynamically, and it's really easy to iterate through my analysis without having to be dependent on having to find all those calculations ahead of time. Okay, the last thing that I'll mention is really not about questions, but it's all the ancillary tools that we've built into Ask Data to make it more fun and collaborative and engaging. One feature that we didn't talk about in the keynote, but it's one of my personal favorites, are usage analytics. So you'll notice in the bottom right of the screen that there's a button for usage analytics. We'll touch on that a little bit later in the demo. Okay, so what are all these buttons on the toolbar? We have the ability to share Ask Data. So what I can do is share this analysis without having to save that content. So this is an ephemeral state of Ask Data that I can use to share ad hoc analysis without having to worry to save it and clutter my server if there are just random ad hoc questions I want to answer, but I think that someone else will find value in it. We'll talk about embedding in more detail in just a few minutes, but you can leverage that to bring Ask Data into entirely different workflows within Tableau and outside of Tableau. And lastly, you can save all of these great questions into a workbook. And this workbook is just a standard Tableau workbook where you can take advantage of all the other capabilities like metrics, creating dashboards, data-driven alerts, and all the things that you would do in Tableau today. So it's fully integrated, and that's also another great way if you want to see how that question would have been reconstructed in drag and drop. So a lot of really great tools outside of just natural language interface to take advantage of. So that was the keynote demo, and let's get back into the slides. Okay, this is one of the most common questions that our customers have today. I know what Ask Data is, but how do I start? How do I get going so that I can bring this to as many of my people and users as possible? So in this talk, we'll give you all the tips, best practices, and tricks that you need to start driving adoption and start taking advantage of this capability. So phase one, you have Ask Data, hopefully. And then there's phase three, how do we drive self-service analytics for as many people as possible? But there's something in the middle that we kind of glossed over. Phase two. And mostly, people are not totally lost, but they need a little guidance and some best practices to help get you there. And that's exactly what we're going to cover today to make sure that you understand what phase two entails, it's not scary, and so that you can go rock phase two once you get back after TC. And yes, that is my Bitmoji. Okay, so how are we going to talk about those best practices? We're going to leverage Tableau Blueprint as a concrete framework of using and understanding Ask Data throughout your analytics journey in your organization. And although Blueprint encompasses a lot of different areas, we're specifically going to talk about Ask Data. And as you heard in the keynote, there's really three core components to the Blueprint. There's agility of your deployment, there's the proficiency of your users, and there's the community in terms of how you engage and communicate with everyone in your organization and beyond. So we'll use that as a framework to talking about scaling Ask Data. Okay, so when you look at Blueprint holistically, you'll notice that agility, community, and proficiency can all happen in parallel. And it's not a linear process. You might be jumping between different of those stage gates, but before you get into driving that whole journey, you'll notice that there's a precursor. There's an analytics strategy and defining advocacy. Those are essential bits to have a good perspective on before you go too far down driving that usage and driving that adoption. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about how you can reason about those things with Ask Data.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to craft your analytics strategy, but specifically how it pertains to Ask Data. Now, Ask Data is going to accelerate and help drive your self-service vision for analytics at your organization. It's about how do we help people get the insights that they need without putting burden on the rest of the organization. And helping drive a data culture, having everybody in the organization buy into making decisions using data as opposed to using intuitions or guessing when there's information that they could be using to make much better decisions on a daily basis. So, how do we do that? Well, it starts with understanding who the personas are in your organization and the role that they have in your analytics strategy. So we're going to put some names to these personas so that it's a little bit easier for us to talk about them. On the left side, we have our data consumers. These are the people in your organization who consume analytics. They're not actively engaged in asking new questions, but they're definitely going to those dashboards and to those pre-built visualizations so that they can understand what's going on in the business. Now on the right side, we have our analysts. These are the people who are doing the raw analysis. They're going into Tableau, they're building new dashboards, they're manipulating and transforming data to answer those critical business questions. But in the middle, we've got this new group, and we're going to call them data conversationalists. Data conversationalists are defined by two characteristics. They need to answer questions with data, and analytics is not their primary job. They're not going to be data consumers. They're not satisfied with the pre-existing reports. They need to ask follow-up questions. They need to have that data conversation. But they're not analysts. Their full-time job is sales or marketing or being a professor at a university. They have a key focus, but they want to go deeper. So how do we make this happen? Your organization might look a little bit like this. You've got a lot of data consumers who are using pre-built dashboards. You have a few data conversationalists who aren't satisfied with the pre-built dashboards, but where do they go when they want more information? They ask the analysts or the IT organization to build some custom reports to answer their new questions. But there's a problem with this model, and a lot of you are really familiar with this. There's a bottleneck. Your analysts are overwhelmed by the number of questions that these data conversationalists are asking, and we need to give them a better way to get insights. Here is the new model. Instead of going to the analysts in the IT organization, the data conversationalists use Ask Data. This alleviates that channel of information between the analysts and the data conversationalists. We call it breaking the data loop, giving those conversationalists the ability to have a self-service feedback loop with the data itself. And something that you'll also notice with this process is that a lot of your data consumers are going to become data conversationalists because now it's so much easier to get access to those deeper insights into your data. So, how do we actually go about doing this? How do we decrease dependency on the analysts and the IT organization to get to those basic insights? This is what we're talking about today, and it's all about bringing analytics to everyone. So let's talk about the first step, which is getting an advocate for the process. I'll bring it back to Ruhab.
And so advocacy is really important for a variety of different reasons. Someone has to believe that analytics ubiquity is important, and that can happen in a variety of different ways. It can be bottoms up. We may have specialized teams that are really far along the analytical maturity curve and are driving the best practices and modeling the beacon of analytics in an organization. Or it might be top down, where your executives are making it a mandate that we become a data culture. We need to bring data to support our decisions and drive our strategy forward. And it can really happen in both ways, whether it's driven by the business or by IT. The most important part of this is finding an advocate who believes that analytics should be thought of in a different way, beyond just being a dashboard factory and driving self-service. Who is that advocate in your organization? I encourage you to really think about that. It can be anyone, from a local team to the senior-most executive. It's important to find those advocates and help them be an evangelist to drive the next generation of self-service analytics. Okay, so we've kind of touched on how do we think about our self-service strategy, why advocacy is important, and we're going to spend time now to talk about all the things you need to worry about in your deployment to make sure you have a really successful Ask Data experience for your entire organization at scale. And so there's 4 key parts of the deployment. There's checking the version to make sure you have Ask Data, identifying some of the use cases of who are those data conversationalists and what are the workflows that I can enable for them. We'll then touch on the curation of data and the lightweight process of how you can really elevate your existing data to make it work for a natural language system. And lastly, we'll talk about access and performance and all those important details that really help you make that Ask Data experience as seamless and smooth as possible. So let's talk about versions. We launched Ask Data in 2019.1. So that's kind of the prerequisite. You have to be on a version that's 2019.1 or later. It's available both for Tableau Server and for Tableau Online, and it's built in for our existing customers who have both our subscription-based model and our legacy model for creators, interactors, and explorers. They automatically get Ask Data. Okay, I want to take a second to touch on the 4 releases of Ask Data and the capabilities that we introduced with each of those releases. So if you're thinking about upgrading, I want to make sure you understand what capabilities you'll get with each version of Ask Data. As I mentioned, we launched in 19.1, which was in February of 2019. In 2019.2, we enabled things like multiple sheets, usage analytics, and some of those ad hoc calculations that you saw me conduct in the demo. In 2019.3, we introduced our embedded cases of how you can bring Ask Data into completely new workflows outside of the core Ask Data experience, as well as some really great things of adding value-level synonyms that we'll touch on in just a few minutes. And in our most recent release, we've supercharged 2019.4 with more advanced calculations like those year-over-year calculations, the link sharing capabilities that you saw, as well as new site settings of how you can control Ask Data across the server and site. And if you don't know what some of these things are, that's okay, because we'll touch on them throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's talk about use cases. How do we find those conversationalists? What are the data sources that I should consider when using Ask Data? The first thing to do to think about who those conversationalists might be is think about your stakeholders today. Which teams are using the dashboards that are being created? Who's asking you all those follow-up questions or sending you those emails with the tons of basic insights that can likely be answered in a self-service model? And lastly, leverage some of that domain expertise to think about which teams are incentivized by using data but aren't today. It seems really basic, but answering those 3 questions can really help shine a light on who those data conversationalists might be in your organization. So what data should I use with Ask Data? The great news here is that all the published data sources in your organization can be leveraged with Ask Data with a little bit of curation that we'll touch on in just a few minutes. There's great usage information that we have today that allows you to understand what's the most commonly accessed data sources or workbooks. That's a really good signal to understand what are the insights that people care about. It's a great way to leverage the existing data that you already have in your organization and take it to the last mile so that you can enable natural language interactions on the data you already have today. Some of the most common use cases that we hear when we talk to our customers are general knowledge workers, the business, right? And these might be people in sales, marketing, operations, finance, or any other business function that is leveraging data today, but are not fully satisfied with just interacting with dashboards. So now that we've touched on some of the use cases, let's talk about the workflows you can enable for these conversationalists. The first is by accessing the published data sources directly. And you can do this in a variety of different ways today that I'm sure all of you already know. You can search for it, you can favorite it. It's really simple. The default behavior of going to a data source is Ask Data. But it doesn't stop there. You can also embed Ask Data directly into dashboards or bring it outside of the platform to your internal portals or websites. Think about where your users are today and find the workflow that makes sense for them. And I'm actually going to walk through some examples of how you can leverage those workflows and give you step-by-step instruction on how you can do that. So let's talk about the embedded dashboard scenario. So here I have a dashboard. It's a dummy CFO dashboard. This is not our CFO's dashboard, caveat. And you can see that there's just some interesting KPIs there that people might be interested in. On the upper right, you'll also notice that there is an icon here with a little chat icon. And this is an embedded form of Ask Data that I can interact with directly. Oh, my session timed out, so let's let that restart. And I can interact with Ask Data directly there in context of the dashboard. I see my metrics are heading a certain way. I have a follow-up question, and now you can leverage that embedded experience to answer that question. So let me actually walk through a step-by-step process of how you can do that. So here we have a Superstore data set. And again, my session timed out, so we'll let that restart again. And you'll notice that I've already embedded Ask Data in here, but that was a practice run I did earlier, so I'm just going to delete it and walk through that workflow. All right, the first thing to do is leverage containers. And in the bottom right, you'll notice in the Objects panel of your dashboard, you can bring in a variety of different containers. So I'm simply going to grab a floating horizontal or vertical container, just bring that into the dashboard. Great, I'll drop that in. The next thing to do is enable the show hide functionality, which gives me that nice interaction of opening and closing that window. So I'll just click on this button here for more options, add show and hide. Great. Now I want to bring Ask Data into that container. So what I'm going to do is grab a tiled web page, and we want to pick tiled because we want it to fit that exact window that I created here, and specify a URL. If I did this right, I already have the URL copied, which is just the data source URL for Ask Data. I'll hit OK, and you'll notice that Ask Data has already been brought into that web object. Now I can take advantage of that, and if I want to make this look good, I can simply leverage this button, add my own icon by simply uploading my favorite image. Here I will just choose one that's local on my machine, which is that chat icon. Upload that, and I'm done. As soon as I save this dashboard and go into the viewing mode of it, I'll have Ask Data completely enabled on this dashboard. And it's ready to go. So you saw how easy it was to go through a few basic steps and bring Ask Data directly into the dashboard. But as I mentioned, it doesn't have to stop at the dashboard. You can embed Ask Data in all the websites internally or even externally. So let's take a quick example of how you can do that. So I'm going to use an analogy with Kickstarter. Here I have a page. It's the actual Kickstarter page where they publish a bunch of really interesting information and stats about their program. But all this data is static, and I may want to ask follow-up questions. So this might be a great way of embedding Ask Data directly into that site. So let's take a look at how you would do that. Here, I have a data source on Kickstarter that I pulled from Kaggle. And all I have to do, once it refreshes, is grab the embed icon, and let's just give that 1 second. All right, great. So you'll notice this embed icon on the toolbar. All I have to do is click on that, and we generate all the HTML that your developers would need to embed that in your website. It's so easy, and developers go nuts for this. So I'm just going to copy that HTML. I'm going to open up a text editor that has the source code off that Kickstarter page. Great. I'm just going to add a quick header saying, hey, ask questions about your data. Give a ton of exclamation points because we want to ask a lot of questions. And then I'll just simply paste that code, and I'm done. Now I'm going to save that, launch a local copy of that exact same web page that you just saw a few minutes ago, and you can see Ask Data is now embedded directly in context of that web page. A great way to bring Ask Data directly where your users are today, in the dashboard, directly through the data source, or through your websites. It doesn't matter. those workflows are meant to be designed to be flexible. Okay, so let's go back to the slides and quickly summarize what I did for the dashboard because it's pretty important. So I picked a published data source, grabbed a floating container, made sure it could show and hide, found the right data source to drop it into the URL, and I'm done. That's really a few quick, easy steps that I used to bring the Ask Data into that dashboard. So let's talk about curation.
All right, so you have your use cases picked out, and you know who your data conversationalists are who are going to be using Ask Data, but your data is not ready. How can you make sure that your data sources are ready for a positive and efficient Ask Data user experience? Let's talk about some best practices for what to look for in a data source. The first is that you want to understand what the questions are that your users are going to be asking. Are they going to be asking at the right level of detail of your data source? Are they asking about events? Are they asking about people? What are the kinds of entities that a user may want to know about with their questions? And is that the resolution of the data that you have? Also, think about what kinds of concepts users might care about, and are those concepts actually represented in your data? Maybe you need to join it with another data source to bring in some extra data so that the information that your users are looking for is actually there. Or maybe you need to add a few calculated fields to reflect that information. For example, let's say you've got a data source that has information about birth dates, but you know that your users want to ask questions about age. In that case, it might make sense to add an age calculation so that your users can very easily ask questions about the data that they're looking for. Now, instead of adding more information to your data source, another important consideration is removing unnecessary information. That means unnecessary fields that might be distracting or add extra noise to the analysis process, or removing extra rows that maybe aren't necessary and will slow down the Ask Data experience. You want to make sure that if users can ask questions very quickly, they're able to get the answers back really quickly too. So if you've got a really slow data source, you might consider creating an extract or improving the hardware for the database engine that backs this particular data source, or maybe adding a filter to reduce the amount of data in that data source to the last 30 days or something like that. Lastly, you want to enrich the data source with extra metadata that will make it effective in Ask Data. And in a lot of cases, you're already doing this for your workbooks. But there are a few examples of metadata that I'm going to highlight that are particularly useful with Ask Data. The most important one is the field names. People are going to be asking a lot of questions about the fields, so you want to make sure that those field names are super easy to understand and super legible. Another important consideration is that you want to make sure that the field names are different from each other and that they don't overlap too much. If you have a lot of field names that are very similar to each other, then it's going to be really hard for your users to ask questions about them and Ask Data. A few other things that will be very important is the data type of your fields. Make sure that your date fields are actually marked as date fields. If the date fields are actually number fields or string fields, then you won't be able to take advantage of all of the power that Ask Data provides for being smart about interpreting questions about dates and time. Set the right default aggregation function for your measures. By default, Tableau will aggregate your measures using the sum function, but in some cases that might not make sense. Like, for example, if you have a discount percentage measure on a data source about orders, you probably want to understand the average discount by default instead of summing those percentages, which usually doesn't make sense. And lastly, default format. If you tell Tableau that by default you want a measure to be formatted as a currency or as a percentage, it doesn't just change how that measure appears in the user interface. It also tells Ask Data to be smarter about understanding questions about money or understanding questions about percentage. If people ask questions and they format a value using a percentage symbol, then Ask Data is going to be a lot smarter about that value if your measures have the right default format. Synonyms are a great tool for you to allow flexible communication. because users sometimes don't ask questions using the exact text and terminology that's in your data source. Those are the field names and the actual values themselves. So you can go into Ask Data and add those synonyms to have a really flexible user experience in Ask Data. So let's do a quick glimpse into what it actually looks like to go through this process. And to demonstrate, I'm going to show you two data sources. One data source before it's been curated for Ask Data, and the same data source afterwards. So this is a data source about matches, boxing matches in the UFC. And this is straight off of the UFC stats website. And there are a few observations that we're going to make about the contents of this data source. Let's start with the most important thing, the field names. The way that this data set is organized is that there are two groups of fields. There are the B fields, and then if you scroll all the way down, there are the R fields. That's because there are two players, two fighters in every match, the blue fighter and the red fighter. And you'll notice that the field names are actually exactly the same between the two groups. This causes a lot of problems. To give you a simple example, if I just type in age, I'm going to get two results back. And that's true for every single measure that might be interesting in this data source. Now, you can imagine if you ask a question about multiple fields, if there are two options that come back for every single field, the number of possible interpretations to that question grows rather sizable. So this is pretty confusing, and it makes it really hard to understand what's going on. Also, there are just a lot of fields in this data source. And if your users are looking for a very specific piece of information, it might take them a long time to find what they're looking for. Now, this could make sense and could be the perfect way to organize your data source if you're building a dashboard where the field names are actually going to be hidden from the end users. But in Ask Data, the fields are front and center. So you want to make sure that they're clean and easy to understand. So how can we make this a little bit better? Well, I'm going to jump into a different version of this data source. And right off the bat, you might notice that it seems a lot clearer. I removed all of the underscores from the field names. I removed all of the special characters. Like Ruhab showed in his initial demo, things like hyphens and forward slashes are actually ways of doing calculations in Ask Data. So you want to take them out of your field names. We also got rid of all of the duplication. So now, instead of showing one version of every measure for red and one version of every measure for blue, we pivoted the data source. So now there's only one version of every single measure. So that's a pivot operation that involves transforming the data source, but it helps clean up your fields. And that's what's most important for making sure that your Ask Data data source is super clean and easy to use. So now if I want to know what the average age is, for example, of fighters who won a match, it's really easy to ask that question. That same question is going to be a lot harder to discover with the other version of the data source. So here we have very clean field names. You have very little duplication between the different field names. You have less underscores and special characters. We've also added a few calculations, like for example, whether or not the player that, or the fighter that you're asking about actually won the match. So it's easier to ask questions about that. So we added a few calcs. We did some pivoting, and we changed some of the default formats of some of the measures so that it's a lot easier to ask questions about those fields. So if you're looking at a data source and it's looking kind of like this, your users are probably going to be a bit overwhelmed and they're going to have a hard time. So you want to make sure that you're putting in a little bit of effort to get your data sources to look a little bit more like this. So that's a glimpse into what it looks like to curate a data source for Ask Data. Let's talk about the next stage, which is about configuration. Configuration is the process by which you control who can access Ask Data and how it performs. So let's talk about what you need to do. There are a few key configurations that you should care about with Ask Data. The first is it enabled? And for whom? What's the performance of Ask Data? And if parts of your Ask Data experience are not performing well, making the right configuration changes to speed it right up. And lastly, permissions. Not whether Ask Data is enabled, but whether the right people can access the right data sources for Ask Data. So let's talk about what those actually are, starting with enablement. There are two different types of enablement settings that we give you in Ask Data. The first is at the site level. you can control whether Ask Data is enabled by default or disabled by default for data sources that are published. Right out of the box, Ask Data is enabled by default. But if you want to slow down and make sure that data sources are curated and processed before users start using Ask Data, you can change that at the site level. Now, once you've set your default setting, you can override that default at the data source level. That means going into an individual data source and saying, this data source should be disabled for Ask Data because I specifically don't want users to be able to use Ask Data on that data source. So for the site level setting, all you have to do is go into your site settings and scroll down to the availability of Ask Data section and change the default setting there.
Small caveat, starting in 2019.4 for that setting.
Yes.
The data source level settings are available from the first launch.
This is what those look like. If you go into the data source settings panel, then you have a few different controls available to you. You can control whether the data source supports Ask Data, whether Ask Data is enabled at all, and you can also control how that data source is indexed. We're going to talk about what indexing means in just a second. So that's how you can control the enablement of Ask Data. But now let's talk about performance. Well, before we talk about performance, we need to first understand how Ask Data works a little bit and what the different parts of the process are. The first step of Ask Data is generating something that we call the semantic model. And we do this by indexing the data source. Indexing the data source involves automatically enriching some of the information that's in that data source, like extracting that default format and understanding that it's a percentage field or a currency field, or adding in extra metadata about geography, adding automatic synonyms and things like that. Combining that with statistics about how people have used this data source in the past, as well as popularity data of how frequently certain values actually appear in that data source. And we take in all of that information and we put it into our semantic model, and then that is what powers the natural language query engine that interprets the questions that your users are going to be asking. Then, once they actually ask that question, there are a bunch of different engines or systems inside of Ask Data that help make the system smart to understand questions that users ask. And I'm going to run through a few examples so you can develop an intuition for how they work. Let's say that I have a query, recent income from chairs in Germany. The result that I'm expecting to get back from Ask Data looks a little bit like this. Sum of sales, filter product subcategory to chairs, country in DE, and order date in the last 3 weeks. And you might be looking at this thinking, okay, now how did Ask Data know that that's what I was actually looking for? And there are a few tools that we have to do that. The first is something that we call vague predicates. These are, this is a linguistic concept for English language constructs that are ambiguous and not very explicitly defined, but are generally intuitive to most people. And Ask Data has a few of these built in so that we understand when somebody asks about expensive products, how to map that to an appropriate filter. We also have synonyms, some that are built into Ask Data and some that are user-defined when you're curating your data source, so that when somebody asks a question using language that doesn't exactly reflect what's in your data source, we can still map to the appropriate thing. Next is value indexing. People rarely refer to the field when they're actually filtering on a value. Like, nobody's going to ask a question about recent income where product subcategory is chairs in Germany. That's how SQL queries work, but that's not how human beings talk to each other. And so in order for that to work, we have to index those values. That means we go into the data source, we suck out the values, and we put them into a really, really fast index store so that when you're asking a question like this, we can identify that chairs belongs to the product subcategory field in 25 milliseconds. And lastly, we have semantic knowledge about the real world. This person asked a question about Germany, but there is no Germany in your data source, but you happen to have a country code field. And that country code field has a value called DE, and we happen to know that DE is the country code for Germany, so we're going to map those two things together. So these are a few examples of intelligent components of the Ask Data engine that help users have successful Ask Data experiences. So with that in mind, You know a little bit about the semantic model, you know a little bit about the indexing process, and about what happens when we parse a question. Let's talk about the performance of these pieces and how you can tune them. So there are a few things that we can do. We have our indexing performance and we have our natural language parsing performance. And if your indexing is slow, there are a few things that you can change about your data source and your server to make them faster. If your parsing is slow, we've got a few different things that you can do. And here's a chart that maps out what they actually are. If your indexing is slow, you want to reduce your data. That means reducing the number of rows in that data source. That means reducing the number of fields in that data source. Maybe it means changing the actual data source itself, switching to use an extract instead of a live connection, or maybe improving the hardware that's backing that live database that you're using to execute those queries. Because indexing under the hood is actually going to that data source, sucking up those values, and putting them in that index store so that we can be super natural about answering those natural language questions. And then for the parsing, if your parsing is slow, then instead of reducing the amount of data that you have, you want to make sure that your fields and your data source schema is simple. So what that means is maybe reducing the number of fields that you have in your data source. Maybe it means renaming your fields so that they're more distinct from each other. Because when you have lots of very similar fields, then when we're parsing that natural language question, it's a lot harder to narrow down on the very precise answer that you're looking for. Lastly, if you're running into some performance problems on either side, it may be worthwhile to change the memory that's allocated to some of the components that are built into Tableau that power Ask Data. One of those, for example, is a new system called Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is that index store that we put your values into so that we can really, really quickly extract them and understand what you're asking about. We also use Data Server, which is the internal Tableau service that powers a lot of the query evaluation that powers Ask Data. So if you're running into some performance problems, you may want to increase the amount of memory that's allocated to Elasticsearch, or you might want to scale out the instances of Data Server that are in your Tableau server deployment. If you're using Tableau Online, then you don't have to worry about any of this because we take care of that for you. All right, we've talked about enablement, we've talked about performance. I'm going to give it back to Ruhab so that he can talk a little bit about permissions for Ask Data.
All right, the good news is that there's actually not a lot to talk about with permissions because Ask Data inherits your entire permission model directly. The most important permission to think about with Ask Data is that connect to data source permission. Because ultimately, your questions are actually querying those underlying data sources. So you need to have that connect to data source permission. But other than that, all of your existing permissions are inherited with Ask Data. So if you've restricted a project to not be able to save or not down the full data, we respect all those permissions so that you can simplify how you think about enablement and governance without having to think about unique features across the platform. Okay, quick disclaimer on row-level security. We know that there's a lot of sensitive data out there, and we want to respect that. There's a lot of really unique ways that you can enforce row-level security into your data today. At the user level, at the data source level, it's very flexible. Ask Data does not create a data index for data sources that have row-level security. And that's because we don't want to expose sensitive values that people should not have access to. One way to alleviate this is taking this example. So let's say you have a data source with 4 sales territories, north, south, east, and west. If you split them up into multiple data sources and manage permissions for those, that's one way to circumvent the issue. But we know this is not an elegant solution, and we're working hard towards building a more native solution for row-level security later next year. So bear with us on that. All right, quick recap of the deployment phase, because we just talked about a whole ton of stuff. Check your version. It has to be on at least 19.1, and it's been supercharged ever since. With use cases, we've talked about how you might be able to think about your data conversationalists in your organization and talk about that role transformation that Ryan mentioned from making those data consumers become a little bit more self-sufficient. use your existing Tableau usage information to find data that people are already accessing today. And we talked about how you can apply the various workflows of accessing data sources directly or embedding Ask Data. From a curation standpoint, we talked about anticipating questions, which will help you understand the grain and level of detail of the data that your conversationalists are interested in. We talked about simplification and the field properties that not only make the system feel more conversational, but it can also help with performance. And lastly, there was a few aspects of configuration, right? We talked about the enablement of being on by default or off by default, the various layers of performance, which was indexing and natural language parsing, and then permissions, which is really easy because everything is inherited. Okay, so now that we've talked about deployment, let's talk about the next step, which is moving into proficiency and the community and really starting that first pilot. One thing that we found helpful is to educate and help people on board into Ask Data and into analytics in general. Going from a data consumer into a data conversationalist can be scary. And data is complex, and it's very much modeled based on your organization's structure. So it's helpful to walk through your users with the data so that they can understand all the nuances that will make them feel confident in asking questions, and then finding a communication model that works for your organization. More advanced and mature companies have established Circle of Excellences for Tableau that can leverage that centralized organization to really manage and distill a lot of that communication. Or you might have to find ad hoc ways of groups or emails to make sure that people are in the loop, they know how to engage with everyone in the IT analyst and Ask Data sort of community that's being built out. And lastly, we find it helpful to facilitate a kickoff. Get all your users who are starting that pilot together, walk through example questions, show them the power of what's capable, and help change that mindset of being able to move into a true self-service model as opposed to just being a consumer. And that shift is hard, and it does require a few steps like these just to get them confident and going. So how do you start that pilot? And it can really happen both from the IT organization or driven by the business. If you're in the IT, just think about the groups that you interact with today. Or if you're in the business, think about how you might get the data that you need to be successful. All the curation workflows that Ryan mentioned today are easy to do in prep or desktop, but if you need a little extra help, you might have to partner with your IT team. Okay, so now that we've talked about deployment, found some users, got our first pilot going, how do we stay engaged and see what's happening in my organization? And I can do this with Ask Data Usage Analytics. This is built in directly into Ask Data so that you can understand trends of how that usage is growing over time, who's using it, what fields are important to them, which might be a really good signal for you to go add those aliases for the fields that people are interacting with most often, or deleting the fields that people aren't using and are just cluttering the cognitive model of that data source. And lastly, you can actually see the exact questions that users are asking so that you can understand what's important to them, and that might also help you bring those common insights into other dashboards that people are using today that didn't have that insight. Just a great way of using existing Tableau functionality to help you keep track of usage of Ask Data. Okay, so we glossed over a few of these items, and so what we're going to do is just spend 1 minute to recap everything that we just talked about, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So we defined an analytics strategy. We thought about how Ask Data fits in there so that we can help create a model for answering those basic questions without having that bottleneck that Ryan highlighted earlier. We found an advocate who believes in that and that can help propel and evangelize that first pilot forward. And we found use cases that might be helpful for that first use case. From a deployment standpoint, we found data, we curated it, and then we optimized our configurations to make Ask Data work seamlessly behind the scenes. And then we started with the pilot. As much as I'd like to believe that Ask Data will just work for everybody right out of the box, it's really helpful to start with a closed pilot and think about how that works for users and then grow that organically. Onboarding your users is very helpful, and this process is meant to be iterative. You're not going to get it right in that first pilot. Connect with your users, use the usage analytics, iterate, refine the data, and make that sort of engaging and iterative process because it's designed to be that way. Lastly, feel free to leverage your Tableau Customer Success Manager along that journey. In a few minutes, I'll give our contact information as well, and you can also reach out to us, and we'd be happy to help you give best practices or partner with you to make sure you're successful in your journey with Ask Data. And so how do you partner with us? Simply scan this QR code and fill out a quick 3-field survey, and we'll be in touch with you right after TC. Or you can simply visit this URL, and you'll get the same survey, and I'll be sure to reach out and see how we can help you along that journey. I'll just pause here for a quick second so that everyone can capture this slide. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, the boring stuff. Please take the survey so that we can see how we did, and hopefully give this presentation again at TC next year. If you can't get enough of Ask Data or want to get sort of a more basic understanding, I'll be giving an introduction to Ask Data session on Friday. There's also a variety of different options to get hands-on with Ask Data, walk through examples on a curated data source that we've built, and then Ryan will be speaking later this afternoon about semantics and metadata inheritance about Tableau and how that really helps drive more intelligence in the platform. In the showcase, just somewhere over there, we have a demo station where you can see demos, get your hands on, and we have a feedback session where you can partner with our user research team to provide feedback on future ideas that we're trying to get feedback from all of you. Okay, so that's our presentation. Hopefully you took away something really helpful and meaningful to take back to your organization, and we'll open up the rest of the next 5 minutes or so for Q&A.